December 1975 saw winter cold hang over Manor Township, Pennsylvania, where snow covered agricultural fields under gray skies and small houses bordering calm streets where neighbors knew each other by name. A 19-year-old newlywed was discovered knifed to death in her own flat on a freezing afternoon. Returning from work, her husband found her body at the unlocked door, with no marks of forced entry and the little living room covered in her blood. Authorities suspected someone she knew, a break-in gone awry. But the murderer disappeared into the Pennsylvania winter, leaving behind only questions and a grieving family despite gathering proof and interviewing many local people. Lindy Sue Beckler's case remained a frozen mystery for nearly 5 decades, her name whispered in Manor Township like a ghost refusing to depart. Her parents kept her bedroom unchanged, her wedding gown still hanging in the closet, a quiet memorial to a life stolen too quickly. Then in 2022, a genealogist collaborating with Pennsylvania State Police uploaded DNA from the crime scene into a public genealogy database, and within weeks, a name emerged that would shake the community to its core. That name belonged to someone who had lived in Manor Township for decades, walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, and had never once been considered a suspect. What happened next would prove that even after 47 years, justice can still speak. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten tales to light, and the algorithm gods will make certain you miss none of future uploads. December 5, 1975, the afternoon sky over Manor Township, Pennsylvania hung low and drab. A thick covering of gray sat down on the meadows, with little houses spaced along the dirt roadways. Snow had fallen sporadically all the week, creating a thin coating of white over inactive fields and gravel driveways. The temperature hovered slightly above freezing, kind of cold that descended through garment seams and produced breath visible in little clouds. The radiator softly hissed inside the tiny second-floor apartment on West Delp Road, fighting the cold that crept through the aging windows. Kenneth was the kind of December day when people stayed inside, when the earth seemed muted and far away, when sound moved oddly across the crisp air. At roughly 5:15 p.m., as the weak sun started its decline behind the barren trees that lined the property, Beckler steered his work truck down the small driveway beneath the flat he shared with his wife. He was 19 years old, a young man with calloused hands and the quiet attitude typical of those raised in rural Pennsylvania. Their marriage, a small gathering at the local Lutheran church attended by family and a few close friends, had taken place just 5 months ago. They had leased this little 2-room flat above a detached garage, a place that was within his mechanic's salary and her part-time revenue from the flower store in close Lancaster. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and they had spoken often of saving for something greater, perhaps a modest house with a garden, some place they could start a family. Kenneth ascended the external wooden staircase, shoes brushing against the weathered planks sprinkled with snow. He held his metal lunchbox in one hand, the thermos within still half full of cold coffee. The afternoon had been lengthy, spent under the chassis of a Ford pickup, his fingertips numb despite the warmth provided by the shop space heaters. He was waiting for warmth, for the scent of whatever Lindy had cooked for dinner, for the comforting quiet they usually shared in the evenings. Her magazine was reading while he tinkered with the little radio he had been trying to fix for weeks. The door was unlocked. That detail would later become one of several haunting him. They rarely locked the door during the day in Manor Township, where crime was something happening in cities and places a distance from here. Not in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors waved from porches and left casseroles on doorsteps for someone who became ill. But the first thing Kenneth noticed was the chill when he opened the door and turned the knob. The apartment was freezing. Inside it was colder than the December outside. The radiator was inactive. Then he noticed the fallen chair. The little living area was messy. The coffee table had been pushed off its side. A lamp lay, its shade shattered. The bulbs shattered. A magazine rack had spilled its contents across the threadbare carpet. Kenneth's eyes moved across the scene in fragments, his mind not yet able to assemble the pieces into comprehension. And then he saw her. Lindy Sue Beckler lay on the floor near the kitchenette doorway, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm stretched toward the doorway, as if she had been trying to crawl to escape. Her light blue sweater was dark with blood, soaked through the fabric, clinging to her. Her face was toward the wall, long brown hair pouring onto the floor, and for a fleeting, illogical second, he believed she had fallen and hurt herself in some manner. If he said her name, she would rouse, turn toward him, and demand assistance. Lindy Sue Beckler, however, did not move. Her lips were slightly puffing, and her skin had become a waxy pallor. The apartment smelled of copper, and something else, something horrible and biological Kenneth would never be able to forget. Frozen in the doorway, lunchbox falling from his grasp and smashing to the ground, the sound remarkably loud in the terrible silence, his throat stiffened, his eyes narrowed, and then a guttural scream burst from his chest, a sound he did not recognize as his own. He tripped back, hitting the door frame, and then he was moving, feet stomping down the wooden steps, almost falling. Kenneth caught himself on the railing. He dashed to the Zimmerman's little brick ranch 50 yards down the road where an elderly couple had resided for 30 years. He gasped as he pounded on their door. Breath was coming in ratchet gasps. Mrs. Zimmerman's face registered immediate panic at the sight of the young guy on her porch, wild-eyed and as pale as death itself. "Call the police," Kenneth managed, voice breaking. "Something happened to Lindy. I think she's dead." Local police and the volunteer fire service of Manor Township arrived within minutes, their cars tearing gravel up as they parked in the little driveway. The first to climb the stairs was Officer Raymond Truzzle. His hand naturally reached for the gun on his hip, although he did not draw it. Eyes scanning the chaos, he entered the flat cautiously and then saw what Kenneth had seen. With his voice firm and professional, he turned his radio on right now. "County detectives are required. We need them now." As night descended into total darkness, the Lancaster County detectives arrived, their headlights cutting across the rural gloom. Crime scene tape was strung across the base of the staircase, its yellow length fluttering in the wind. Neighbors had started to gather at a respectable distance, brought by the flashing lights, by the grim procession of official vehicles. Word traveled fast in Manor Township. By nightfall, everyone within 5 miles knew that something horrible had happened to the young Beckler girl. One who worked at the florist shop, the one who had gotten married in July, the one whose smile people remembered from church potlucks. Within the flat, detectives moved with methodical precision. Photographs were taken from every angle, the flashbulbs casting harsh white light across the scene, the overturned furniture, the blood patterns on the floor and walls, the position of Lindy's body, all documented in clinical detail. A kitchen knife was found near her body, a usual serrated blade with a wooden handle, its surface slick with blood. It looked to be from the apartment's own kitchen, drawn from the drawer in the moments of violence. The medical examiner, a gay-haired man named Dr. Feldman, who had seen more death than most in Lancaster County, knelt beside Lindy's body. His examination preliminary but telling. Multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen, defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. She had fought. She had fought hard. There was no sign forced entry's cause. The entrance had opened. The windows are whole. Nothing seemed to have been taken. Lindy left her handbag on a countertop, her wallet inside, a few visible dollar bills. Her little jewelry box on the dresser in the bedroom stayed unopened. This was not a heist. This was also something more personal and more frightening. Detectives questioned Kenneth Beckler in the back of a patrol vehicle. His hands trembled as he answered questions, his alibi strong and verifiable. He had been at the garage all day. Coworkers confirmed it. Time cards backed it up. His grief was raw, obvious, the sort that could not be faked. By midnight, the apartment had been processed. Lindy's body was carefully put in a black bag and carried to the county morgue, and the little group of neighbors had scattered, retreating to their residences where they locked doors seldom locked before. Manor Township, a location where violence was an abstraction, where newspaper reports from afar characterized risk cities, had been damaged. And in the days that followed, as snow fell and Christmas came with heartless nonchalance, one question echoed throughout every talk, every whispered communication at the supermarket, every sermon at the Lutheran church. Who would do this to Lindy Sue Beckler, and why? Lindy Sue Beckler was born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on March 14, 1956. second child of Raymond and Miriam Beckler, a family whose local roots stretched back generations. Her father was employed as a foreman at a nearby manufacturing facility. His days were lengthy and physically demanding. Her mother managed the home and worked part-time at the county library, reshelving books and assisting patrons in locating items. They resided in a modest two-story house on the fringes of Manor Township, surrounded by farmland where the horizon was flat and unending, save for silos and the occasional group of trees. It was a region that created a specific kind of person, pragmatic, laborious, humble, deeply ingrained in tradition and community. Lindy grew up with her older brother David, a reserved child who would eventually join the army, and her younger sister Karen, who at 11 years old in 1975 still adored Lindy with the intense devotion that younger siblings frequently have. Friends and neighbors recalled Lindy as a quiet girl with a talent for flower arrangements and the ability to make even the simplest bouquet seem classy. She preferred listening over speaking. Lindy went to Manor Township High School, where she was neither the most popular nor the most outspoken, but rather someone who moved quietly through the hallways. Her long brown hair was frequently pulled back in a basic ponytail, her grin pleasant but muted. She sang in the church choir, her clear soprano voice rising over the others during Sunday services, and volunteered at the nearby nursing home on weekends. She found employment at a tiny flower store called Petals and Stems on the main street of Lancaster. A 20-minute journey from Manor Township was run by an elderly lady named Margaret Stoner for almost 3 decades who quickly grew fond of Lindy. Later on, tears streaming down her elderly face, Margaret would tell police that Lindy had a capacity to understand what people needed, even when they were unable to express it themselves. A guy coming in for an anniversary bouquet would leave with something that perfectly captured his love. A lady requesting funeral arrangements would find herself soothed by Lindy's silent sympathy, her capacity to recommend lilies or roses honoring loss without overpowering it. Lindy adored the work, the aroma of fresh-cut stems, and the way sunlight filtered through the shop's front window late in the day created patterns across the wooden counter. It was at a summer barbecue in 1973, held by mutual friends in a garden littered with picnic tables and a smoking grill, that Lindy met Kenneth Beckler. Their shared surname was sheer chance. Becklers abounded Lancaster County, the name common among the Pennsylvania Dutch families who had settled the area ages ago. Kenneth, a year older, worked as a mechanic's apprentice with permanently ingrained grease underneath his fingernails and a reserved smile mirroring Lindy's own subdued attitude. They chatted briefly that evening, close to the yard's edge where fireflies twinkled and gathered in dusk, and realized they had gone to the same childhood church. Though their families had moved to several religions over the years, their courtship was unhurried and unremarkable in the manner many enduring relationships are. They went to movies at the single-screen Lancaster Theater, shared ice cream cones on warm evenings, and drove down back roads with the radio gently playing. Kenneth introduced Lindy to his love of old cars, taught her the names of engine parts, and gave him tools. Kenneth escorted Lindy to the flower shop to show him how to cut stems at an angle as he worked under hoods in his employer's garage. He taught her how to remove thorns from roses without harming the petals. They fit together rather well, 2 reserved persons who realized love need not be boisterous or theatrical to be genuine. In the spring of 1975, Kenneth proposed. There was no grand gesture, no restaurant with a hidden ring and a champagne glass. Instead, he asked her one Sunday afternoon while they were seated on her parents' home's porch, smelled of freshly turned dirt drifting from neighboring fields. He made a modest gold band with a small diamond, a ring he had saved for more than 6 months, and Lindy replied yes without hesitation, her eyes glistening with something beyond pleasure, something closer to certainty. They were wed at St. John's Lutheran Church on July 19, 1975, a little white building with a steeple visible across the flat terrain. Fewer than 50 individuals, immediate family, a few close friends, and several elderly church members who came out of habit and love. Lindy chose a simple white dress, not elaborate, but elegant, with lace sleeves and a small train. Her mother had helped her select it from a bridal store in Lancaster.
Kenneth wore a dark suit borrowed from his father, his hair neatly combed, his hands trembling somewhat as he slid the ring on Lindy's finger. The church basement served as the setting for the reception. Folding tables were covered with homemade dishes brought by attendees, and a local musician performed guitar while others danced or stood in groups chatting and laughing. Photographs taken that day feature a young couple quietly beaming with pleasure. Lindy smiles genuinely, and her palm rests in Kenneth's. Their faces turned toward one another with an intimacy the camera almost seems to intrude upon. In one image, Lindy stands next to her mother and sister, all three ladies holding little bouquets of wildflowers Lindy had created that morning. Kenneth and his father stand near the church entrance wearing identical restrained smiles in another. These pictures, kept in a photo album Miriam Beckler would eventually have on her lap as she sobbed, capture a time the future felt secure and the modest aspirations of a young couple seemed completely within reach. After the wedding, Lindy and Kenneth moved into the second-floor apartment on West Delp Road, a place they had found through a classified ad in the local newspaper. The rent was affordable, the location convenient to both Kenneth's garage and Lindy's flower shop. The apartment was small, just a living room, a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a cramped bathroom, but Lindy set about making it a home. She hung curtains she had sewn herself, arranged plants on the windowsills, and placed a framed wedding photo on the narrow mantel above the electric heater. Kenneth built a small bookshelf from scrap wood, and Lindy stuffed the box with paperback books from the library and a few cookbooks her mother had given her. Most nights they shared supper of plain meatloaf or spaghetti. On weekends, windows down, radio playing softly, they traveled to see family or toured Lancaster County back roadways. In the months after their marriage, Lindy talked frequently of the future. She told Margaret at the flower shop that Kenneth and she were saving to purchase a modest home with a backyard where they might establish a garden. She told her mother she wished to have children, 2 or 3 perhaps, and that she envisioned raising them in Manor Township, where the schools were excellent and the tempo of life was leisurely. On a trip in late November, she told her sister Karen that she felt happier than she had ever been, that marrying Kenneth was everything she had hoped it would be, that she felt safe, loved, and content. Early on December 5, 1975, Lindy rose as usual. After 7 o'clock, Kenneth left for the garage, kissed her farewell at the door, and Lindy spent the morning cleaning the apartment, washing in the shared machines in the building's basement, and preparing a grocery list for the weekend. She had the day off from the flower shop, an uncommon Friday at home, and intended to spend it catching up on tiny chores. Neighbors would later report seeing her that morning hanging laundry on the outdoor line despite the cold, her breath visible in the winter air, her movements slow and usual. 4 hours later, Kenneth would find her body and the life they had built building. No one saw who came to the door that afternoon. No one heard the knock or voice that may have coaxed Lindy to open it. The final confirmed sighting of Lindy Sue Beckler live was at around 1 p.m., as a mail carrier delivering a package to a neighboring house waved to her as she stood on the little stoop outside the apartment, shaking out a rug. She waved back, smiled, and vanished within. Together. In a murder investigation, the little hopes and quiet joy would be recorded as evidence. The girl who organized flowers and sang in the church choir and had faith in the goodness of people would become a name on a case file, a victim whose face would be published in newspapers and whose death would haunt Manor Township for decades. December 5, 1975 started as any other Friday in Manor Township. The temperature hovered around 34 degrees, chilly enough that moisture in the air formed a thin haze across the fields, but not cold enough for the predicted snowfall to materialize. The sky remained a uniform gray, the kind of overcast that made it difficult to distinguish morning from afternoon, that flattened the landscape into muted tones of brown and white. Lindy Sue Beckler traveled through her morning routine inside the second-floor flat on West Delp Road with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had the day to herself. Kenneth had left for work at 7:15 a.m. His truck's engine coughed to life in the cold, exhaust seen in white plumes as he drove out the driveway. Lindy stood at the window, still in her nightgown and robe, observing him leave, waving one hand listily that he answered before disappearing down the street. It was a gesture they'd repeated every workday morning, a small ritual marking the beginning of their separate days. She poured herself a second cup of coffee from the percolator on the stove, added a spoonful of sugar, and seated at the little kitchen table to go over her task list for the day. Laundry, grocery. Lindy had dressed in dark slacks and a light blue sweater by 9 a.m., casual attire for a day spent at home. She gathered the laundry from the bedroom hamper and carried it downstairs the external steps to the communal laundry room in the basement, a dark space with 2 washers and 1 dryer rattling strongly while operating. Mrs. Keller, an elderly lady living in the ground, when Lindy entered, she was folding towels. They exchanged nice greetings. Mrs. Keller would later tell police Lindy appeared completely normal that morning, happy, even mentioning she wanted to go see her parents over the weekend and asking if Mrs. Keller required anything from the store. There was no sign of concern. She did not indicate any uneasiness or anticipate anybody. Lindy loaded her washing, set the machine to operate, and came back upstairs to wait. Around 11 a.m., Lindy retrieved the damp. She carried the laundry outside to the clothesline hung between 2 metal posts in the backyard behind the building. The scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney carried by the wind increased somewhat. She pinned the clothes methodically, her hands reddening in the cold, her breath forming tiny clouds. A passing driver on West Delp Road later recalled seeing a young woman hanging laundry, but thought nothing of it. Manor Township was a place where such scenes were typical, insignificant. The texture of daily life created from little household chores done without hurry or dramaturgy. By lunchtime, Lindy was back indoors. She prepared a simple meal, making a cheese and tomato sandwich on white bread, and ate it while standing at the counter, gazing out the window at the bare trees on the property. The radiator made hissing and clanking sounds, showing that the old heating system was struggling against the cold December air. After she washed her plate, dried it off, and put it back in the cupboard, she found a comfy spot in the living room, settling into a well-used armchair with a magazine. It was a good housekeeping issue that her mom had given her, filled with holiday recipes and decorating ideas. Around 1 p.m., the mailman, Gerald Huck, who had been delivering mail in Manor Township for 12 years, drove along West Delp Road. He parked his truck at the bottom of the apartment building's driveway and took a package to a nearby house. When he came back to his truck, he noticed Lindy on the small steps outside her apartment shaking out a small rug that people often put by their doors to catch dirt and snow. He waved at her, and she waved back with a smile before going back inside. Later, Huck would say that she looked totally relaxed, showing no signs of worry or fear. He drove off, continuing his route, and that was when Lindy Sue Beckler vanished from view. What transpired in the next few hours can only be pieced together through forensic evidence and the sad facts left in her apartment. At some time between 1 and 5:15 p.m., someone came to her door. It's unclear if Lindy opened it on her own, if she knew the person outside, or if there was a knock or a familiar voice. The door had no signs of being forced open. The lock was still secure, and the frame was unharmed. This indicated that Lindy might have opened the door herself or that it was left unlocked, which was common in Manor Township, where people trusted each other and crimes were very rare. Whoever came into the apartment had terrible intentions that became frighteningly obvious with the violence that happened next. The living room, small and simply furnished, turned into a scene of chaos. The coffee table was pushed out of the way so hard that it scratched the floor, leaving marks on the thin carpet. A lamp fell over, its ceramic base breaking, and the shade got crushed under furniture that had been knocked over. A magazine rack tipped over too, spilling magazines and their shiny covers all over the floor in a messy scatter. The fight was physical, quick, and very violent. Later, investigators would find out that Lindy struggled to survive. Cuts and bruises on her hands and arms showed she was desperate, trying to shield herself and grabbing at the knife as it kept coming down.
The knife used was a serrated kitchen knife with a wooden handle taken from Lindy's own kitchen drawer. This everyday tool became a deadly weapon. The attacker stabbed Lindy in her chest and stomach with extreme strength. Each cut was deep and made with intent. Blood splashed on the walls in patterns that experts would study later. They would figure out the violence by looking at how blood moved and the angle it splattered. Lindy was trying to get away. Her body was found near the doorway between the living room and the kitchenette. One arm was stretched towards the door, as if she had been crawling, trying to reach outside, trying to find help. But she didn't make it. She fell there, her life slipping away onto the light-colored linoleum floor. The apartment became quiet around her. The radiator kept making a hissing sound. The wind outside shook the windows, and 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beckler, who had been married for less than 5 months, died alone in the home she worked hard to make cozy and safe. The medical examiner's report, written 2 days later, noted that she had 15 stab wounds. Some of these wounds were shallow, gotten during the struggle, while others went deep into important organs. The cause of death was noted as exsanguination, which is a medical term for bleeding to death. They estimated she died sometime between 1:30 p.m. and 4 p.m., a period when Lindy's life ended, but Manor Township went on with its regular Friday, not knowing that something terrible had happened in the second-floor apartment on West Delp Road. There were no people around to see what happened. The other people living in the building were either working or didn't notice anything strange. The Kellers, who lived right above, had gone Christmas shopping in Lancaster and didn't come back until after the police were already there. The closest house was 50 yards away, which was too far for any sounds to be heard clearly, especially since the windows were shut tight from the cold. The person who harmed Lindy Sue Beckler did it in a way that let them commit a terrible crime and then disappear, leaving behind blood, confusion, and a body that was getting cold on the floor. When Kenneth Beckler came home at 5:15 p.m., the apartment had been quiet for hours. The heater was broken and the cold was creeping in through the old windows, making the inside colder than it was outside in December. The door was still unlocked, just like it had been when the attacker left. Kenneth walked into a situation that would split his life into a time before and a time after this moment. This separation was so clear that he would spend the rest of his life trying to come to terms with the memories of the woman he cared about and the terrible sight before him. Lindy's blood had started to darken, changing from bright red to a deep rusty color that stained the linoleum in an odd shape. Her skin had gotten a waxy look of death, her lips were slightly blue, and her eyes were half open and unseeing. The apartment reeked of metal and rotting, a smell that Kenneth would remember and that would wake him up at night for many years. He stood in the doorway, unable to understand what he was witnessing, his mind fighting against the truth in front of him, insisting that this couldn't be real, that Lindy would move, breathe, or open her eyes and ask for help. But she didn't. And at that moment, standing in the cold apartment with his wife's body lying at its feet, Kenneth Beckler realized that the life they were building together, their simple dreams and quiet happiness, had been crushed by a violent act that was so pointless and cruel that it was hard to understand. He stepped back suddenly, dropping his lunchbox, and took off running, his boots thumping down the wooden stairs, gasping for air as his thoughts raced with shock from what he had just seen. It didn't take long for the first police car to show up. Its siren pierced the quiet of the countryside, and in Manor Township, where people usually left their doors open and trusted their neighbors, everyone realized that terrible things could happen out of nowhere, slipping in through an open door on a dull December day and wreaking havoc in just a few minutes. The inquiry into Lindy Sue Beckler's murder kicked off with a seriousness that small towns usually reserve for events that shake their sense of safety. Just hours after Kenneth's panicked call to the Zimmermans, Manor Township and nearby Lancaster County turned into a place full of distrust and suspicion. Every neighbor and everyone who had seen Lindy before her death became a possible witness or suspect. The Lancaster County District Attorney's Office sent its most skilled detectives to handle the situation. These were men who had dealt with murders in the city, but were not used to such violence in small towns. They showed up at the apartment on West Delp Road with heavy boxes full of tools, cameras with flashes, evidence bags, fingerprint powder, and a serious attitude, knowing that the first 2 days would likely decide if they could solve the case or let it fade away into being unsolved. Detective Robert Minnick, a strong man in his early 40s with a short haircut and a careful way of working, headed the investigation. He had spent 15 years handling murders in Lancaster and had seen deadly bar fights and tragic family arguments. But the brutality he discovered in that apartment on the second floor disturbed him in ways he would later share with his wife. There were 15 stab wounds, signs that the victim had tried to defend herself, and a young woman fighting for her life in her own space. The violence showed deep anger or something personal, or maybe it suggested a randomness that made it seem like the attacker could strike again. They examined the apartment with great attention to detail.
Every surface was checked for fingerprints, but the results were frustratingly unclear.
A lot of fingerprints were collected, mostly from Lindy and Kenneth, mixed up and overlapping like prints do in lived-in places. There were a few partial prints found on the doorframe of the kitchen counter that couldn't be identified right away. However, back in 1975, fingerprint databases were small, done by hand, and took a long time. Since there wasn't a suspect to compare with, the prints were stored away. They were pieces of proof waiting for an explanation that might never come. The knife used in the murder, a kitchen knife with a jagged edge and a wooden handle, was packaged and sent to the state crime lab in Harrisburg. It had Lindy's blood on it, which was expected, but also some blood that was very important for the case. It was a small amount of blood that didn't match Lindy's type. During the struggle, the attacker must have cut themselves, likely on their hand or fingers, as Lindy defended herself. In 1975, finding out blood types was all that could be done in forensics. They figured out that the unknown blood was type O, which is common and shared by about 45% of people, but they still noted it down as it was a clue left behind in the violent incident. DNA testing, which would later change criminal investigations forever, wasn't available yet. The blood evidence was kept carefully in a cold evidence locker and mostly put aside while investigators looked into immediate leads. Kenneth Beckler was questioned a lot, as anyone married is in cases of domestic violence. He spent hours in a room without windows at the Lancaster County Police Station, his hand shaking as he answered the same questions repeatedly. Where had he been that day? Who could confirm where he was? Had he and Lindy had any fights recently? Were there money issues, relationship problems, or any signs of trouble? Kenneth's alibi was strong. He had clocked in at the garage at 7:30 in the morning and stayed there until he left at 5:15 in the evening. He was seen by his boss and 3 coworkers who all said he was working on a truck transmission, his hands all greasy, and he acted normally. His sadness was deep and intense, the type that makes you feel physically weak. In one interview, he got so upset that he threw up in a trash can, unable to handle the terrible things he had witnessed. Detective Minnick, who isn't usually affected by feelings, decided that Kenneth Beckler wasn't a suspect. The young husband was actually a victim himself, with his life completely shattered by the same violence that had taken Lindy's away. They started looking at Lindy's friends, but her group was small. She didn't have any ex-boyfriends, except for a short relationship in high school with a guy named Thomas Brenner who had moved to Ohio and was confirmed to be at his factory job on the day she was killed. Her co-workers at Petals and Stems were questioned. Margaret Stoner, the owner of the shop, cried as she talked about Lindy's sweet personality and insisted that she had no enemies, no one who would want to harm her. Another worker, a woman named Doris Yates, agreed with this. Lindy was nice, quiet, and dependable. She was always on time, did her job well, and didn't cause any fuss. There were no unhappy customers, no fights, and no signs that her work at the flower shop had put her in danger. They asked the neighbors about what they knew. The Kellers, who lived below her apartment, had been out shopping and hadn't seen anything. The Zimmermans, who lived about 50 yards away, had been home all afternoon and didn't hear anything strange, although Mrs. Zimmerman mentioned that it was windy and that the sounds from the apartment building rarely reached their house. A farmer who lived a quarter-mile away remembered seeing a dark-colored car parked on West Delp Road that afternoon. It was strange because that road didn't have much traffic and most locals knew each other's cars, but he couldn't remember what kind it was or if anyone was inside. He couldn't give any details to help with the investigation. Detective Minnick and his team made a timeline showing Lindy's last known activities. The mail delivery person, Gerald Hull, had seen her alive at 1 p.m., and Kenneth discovered her body at 5:15 p.m. Somewhere in those 4 hours and 15 minutes, someone got into the apartment, hurt Lindy, and then left. The medical examiner figured that Lindy had died sometime between 1:30 in the afternoon and 4 in the afternoon. This time frame felt both specific and frustratingly vague. Who did Lindy come across during that time? Did someone knock on her door? Did she know them? Did she let them in on purpose, or was the door unlocked, making it easy for someone to walk in since everyone trusted each other in that neighborhood? One idea that started getting attention early in the investigation was that Lindy had been attacked randomly by a stranger who found her alone and defenseless, planning to rob her or hurt her. But this idea started to fall apart when looked at closely. Nothing had been taken. Lindy's purse was on the kitchen counter with her wallet still inside, containing $12 cash. Her small jewelry box in the bedroom was shut, with a few inexpensive items still there. The simple black and white TV was still there too. If the attacker had meant to rob her, they seemed to have left once things turned violent. And if they intended to assault her, there was no proof of that either. The medical examiner saw no signs of any sexual injuries, and even though Lindy's clothes were soaked with blood, they had not been taken off or disturbed more than what happened during the struggle itself. A new darker theory came up, that someone from Manor Township, someone who lived nearby, was the one who killed Lindy Sue Beckler.
The fact that there was no forced entry hinted at someone familiar, and the violence suggested anger, something personal. Detectives began to look closer at the men in Lindy's life, even those who were not very close to her. They talked to a mechanic who worked with Kenneth after a neighbor said he had sometimes come over to the apartment to leave tools. He had an alibi, confirmed by his wife, and a receipt from a hardware store in Lancaster that was time-stamped at 2:47 p.m. They also interviewed a cousin of Kenneth's who had been at the wedding after someone remembered that he danced with Lindy and said she looked pretty. He also had an alibi, proving he was at work 30 miles away. One by one, they looked into these leads, but none of them really went anywhere. Weeks passed and turned into months. The initial burst of excitement in the investigation began to fade. The non-stop interviews and handling of evidence led to the tough truth of a case without a clear suspect. At first, many people called in with tips, inspired by newspaper stories and a segment on local news that showed a picture of Lindy smiling in her wedding dress alongside a request for information. While most tips were well-meaning, they didn't help at all. One person thought they saw a suspicious man near the apartment, but their description was so unclear that it could have matched many men in the area. Another caller claimed a drifter was spotted in Manor Township in early December, but the police found no proof that anyone homeless had been around. There were no reports of break-ins or anything unusual that would indicate an outsider had come through. By spring 1976, the investigation had hit a wall. Detective Minnick kept looking into the case, but other murder investigations needed attention too. There were limited resources and the clues had gone cold. The evidence was carefully organized and kept safe, including the kitchen knife, blood samples, fingerprint cards, and pictures from the crime scene. The thick case file full of reports and interview notes was put away in a cabinet at the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, labeled as Unsolved. Technically, it was still open, but in reality, it became one of those cases that haunted detectives, reminding them of failures in justice and the limits of forensic science from the 1970s. For Lindy's family, not having answers was a pain that would never go away. Raymond and Miriam Beer went to every court hearing linked to the investigation, attended every meeting with detectives, and held on to every small bit of hope that something might change. But as the years went by without an arrest, their hope turned into something darker. They began to accept the harsh reality that whoever had taken their daughter's life might never be found. They kept Lindy's room just as it was, with her clothes still in the closet, her books neatly stacked on the nightstand, and her wedding dress from July carefully preserved in the garment bag. Miriam cleaned the room every week, as if her daughter Lindy could come back any time. She believed that keeping the place tidy would help keep Lindy's memory alive. Kenneth Beckler couldn't stay in Manor Township anymore. The apartment on West Delp Road felt awful. Just looking at it reminded him of his past trauma, making him shake and struggle to breathe. He moved back in with his parents, quit his job at the garage, and eventually left Pennsylvania to start fresh in Delaware, where he worked in construction and tried, with limited success, to create a new life. He never married again. Friends who met him later described him as someone who seemed burdened by deep sadness, as if it surrounded him like a heavy weight. Manor Township also changed over time. Doors that used to be left open were now locked tight. Women who used to walk alone in the evenings started going out in pairs or stayed home after dark. The feeling of safety, the belief that violence occurred somewhere else, was broken.
Lindy Sue Beckler's name became a quiet reminder of what happened, a cautionary story, a ghost that hung over the town like the gray sky during the month she died. The years after Lindy Sue Beckler's murder were filled with silence that felt almost like a choice, as if everyone in Manor Township had decided to let the case be forgotten. The 1980s came and went, bringing new generations who only knew about Lindy's story as a local myth, a sad tale shared quietly by older folks. The 1990s brought growth to Manor Township, as farms turned into neighborhoods and shopping centers. The small apartment building on West Delp Road changed owners several times. The second-floor unit had many renters who rarely stayed long, but it was hard to say if they knew about the past there or just found the place unwelcoming. Raymond and Miriam Beaker grew older, reaching their 70s and then their 80s. Even though their bodies slowed down, their grief never lessened. Every Sunday, they went to St. John's Lutheran Church and always sat in the same seat they had used for many years. Each year, on December 5th, they went to visit Lindy's grave at the little cemetery on the outskirts of town. Miriam would put fresh flowers, mostly white roses, on the grave marker, while Raymond stood quietly next to her, his hand resting on the cool stone, staring at the words that read, Lindy Sue Beckler, born March 14, 1956, died December 5, 1975, cherished daughter and wife. They always held on to the hope that someone out there had information. They thought maybe someone would confess on their deathbed, or a witness might finally speak up. But as the years turned into decades, that hope dwindled and felt more uncertain, something they kept holding on to, not because they truly thought it would happen, but because letting go would feel like betraying their daughter's memory. In 1994, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office was reorganized and began looking over cold cases to see which ones could benefit from new forensic technology. DNA testing, which was still a new tool in solving crimes, was being used more often to resolve cases that had been left unsolved for years. Detective Minnick, who had now retired, was asked about the Beckler case and told the investigators to keep the blood evidence that had been gathered in 1975. The serrated knife, the blood-stained cloth, and the samples taken from the scene of the crime had all been stored in a climate-controlled evidence room. Minnick thought that if DNA technology kept improving, it could someday provide the answers that old-fashioned investigations couldn't find. They listened to his advice. The evidence was carefully kept, labeled, and set aside, waiting for a future that seemed unclear yet possible. That future came slowly and gradually through various scientific improvements and shifts in society that nobody in 1975 could have predicted. By the early 2000s, DNA testing became a common method in criminal investigations, and systems like CODIS, a DNA database managed by the FBI, allowed police to match DNA found at crime scenes with samples from known offenders. But the Beckler case had a problem. The DNA taken from the blood on the knife, which belonged to Lindy's murderer, didn't match anyone in the database called CODIS. The person who killed her had never been caught for any crime and had not had their DNA put into the system. There was evidence, and the science was reliable, but there was no one to match it with. Then, in the mid-2010s, a new option appeared, not from the police, but from the growing interest in family history. Companies like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and GED Match sold DNA testing kits that let people learn about their background and find long-lost relatives. Millions of people sent in their DNA, putting their genetic data into public databases where it could be searched. Police, especially those looking at cold cases, started to see the value of these databases when they couldn't find a suspect's DNA in CODIS. Maybe they could find a relative's DNA in a genealogy site, which would help them build a family tree and find possible suspects using something called genetic genealogy. The big change happened in 2018 with the capture of the Golden State Killer, a case that had been a mystery for many years until investigators used GED Match to find a suspect through distant family connections. This new method was groundbreaking, creating a surge of interest among investigators of cold cases all over the country. In Pennsylvania, state police and district attorneys began looking at old cases to see which ones could use genetic genealogy. The Beckler case, with its well-preserved DNA evidence and no suspects, was a perfect match. In late 2019, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office teamed up with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia company that focuses on genetic genealogy for police work. They uploaded the DNA profile from the blood found on the knife in Lindy's apartment, which had been stored for 44 years, to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database for law enforcement searches. This process was slow and careful. Genealogists at Parabon started to create family trees based on distant relatives whose DNA partially matched the killer's profile. Identifying common ancestors, tracing lineages, and narrowing the pool of potential suspects, they worked backward through generations. The COVID-19 pandemic had halted most of the world by the beginning of 2020. However, the Beer case continued to be worked on remotely. Genealogists poring over birth records, census data, marriage licenses, and obituaries, piecing together a puzzle that spanned more than a century of family history. The investigative team, now led by Detective Christopher Malloy, a young investigator with a background in forensic science, monitored the progress with cautious optimism. Cold cases were well known to be difficult, and although genetic genealogy seemed promising, it was not a sure thing. However, as time went on, the family tree began to take shape, with the circle of branches becoming smaller, potential suspects shrinking. David Sinopoli was found by Parabon's genealogists in March 2022, nearly 47 years after Lindy's death. He was a quiet, unassuming individual who had spent the majority of his life in Manor Township. He was 68 years old. He had never been arrested, never been questioned in connection with Lindy's murder, and had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1989. His name had never been recorded in the investigation's files. Flagged by detectives, had never been whispered as a possibility by neighbors or acquaintances. And yet, according to the genetic genealogy analysis, David Sinopoli was a direct match to the DNA found at the crime scene. Sinopoli's past was examined by Detective Malloy with a mixture of disbelief and grim recognition. In 1975, Sinopoli was 21 years old and lived with his parents in a house on West Delp Road, less than 2 miles from the apartment. He had been employed at a nearby printing plant for nearly 30 years prior to retiring. He had married in 1982, raised 2 children, attended church sporadically, and lived what appeared to be an entirely ordinary life. There were no reports of domestic disturbances, no complaints from neighbors, and no indications in his past that he was anything other than a regular member of the community that suggested violence. But DNA, as investigators had learned again and again, did not lie. Malloy needed to confirm the match before making an arrest.
Genetic genealogy provided probable cause, but a direct DNA comparison was necessary to eliminate any possibility of error. Sinopoli was placed under surveillance, a discreet operation that involved tracking his movements and waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. At the end of March 2022, Sinopoli stopped at a Lancaster coffee shop, ordered a cup of coffee, and read a newspaper at a table near the window. The cup was left behind in a trash can after he left. It was retrieved, packaged, and delivered as evidence by an undercover officer to the state lab for forensics. The comparison was processed within days. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the blood on the knife. The match was absolute, unequivocal, a genetic signature that placed David Sinopoli in Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment on the afternoon of December 5, 1975. Detective Malloy sat in his office staring at the lab report and felt the weight of 47 years pressing down on him. The parents of Lindy were still alive and awaiting an answer someplace. Kenneth Beckler was somewhere living with the memory of what he had found that December evening.
And somewhere David Sinopoli was going about his day, unaware that the silence he had maintained for nearly 5 decades was about to shatter. On June 23, 2022, a gray morning that mirrored the December day when Lindy had died, a convoy of police vehicles pulled up to Sinopoli's modest brick ranch house on the outskirts of Manor Township. In the presence of uniformed police officers, Detective Malloy knocked on the door, and when Sinopoli answered, still in his robe, his face registered confusion, then something closer to resignation. Malloy identified himself, read Sinopoli his rights, and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Lindy Sue Beckler. Sinopoli did not resist, did not protest, did not ask what evidence they had. His expression was blank as he stood still as his wrists were cuffed and his eyes were fixed on something far away from the officers who were surrounding him. In just a few hours, text messages, phone calls, and social media posts spread the word about the arrest throughout Manor Township on social media. For those old enough to remember 1975, the shock was profound. David Sinopoli, the man who had lived among them for decades, raised a family, and frequently frequented the local diner, post office, and grocery store. He had been there all along, a ghost hiding in plain sight, his secret buried beneath the surface of an ordinary life. For Lindy's family, the news arrived via a phone call from Detective Malloy, and the frail and aged Miriam Beer wept into the receiver, her voice cracking as she repeatedly uttered the same phrases, after all these years, after all these years. The genetic genealogy that had identified Sinopoli represented a convergence of science, persistence, and chance. The case would not have been solved if the blood evidence hadn't been preserved in 1975, DNA technology hadn't improved, and millions of people hadn't uploaded their genetic information to public databases. Another file gathering dust in a storage room. But justice delayed by... It had been silent for nearly half a century, and in Manor Township, where the memory of Lindy Sue Beckler had never fully faded, the long silence was broken. The arrest of David Sinopoli sent shockwaves through Manor Township that reverberated far beyond the immediate community. Within a matter of hours, reporters stormed the peaceful streets. They parked their satellite trucks on West Delp Road, cameras trained on the apartment building where Lindy Sue Beckler had died 47 years earlier. Reporters interviewed neighbors, many of whom struggled to reconcile the man they had known for decades with the monster described in the criminal complaint. David was quiet, kept to himself mostly, said one elderly woman who had lived 3 houses down from the Sinopoli family for 30 years. He waved as you drove by while mowing his lawn. This doesn't make sense. But the DNA evidence made perfect sense to investigators. A biological truth that transcended perception and memory, that stripped away the carefully constructed normalcy of a life that was shadowed by an unspeakable act. At Lancaster County Prison, a sprawling facility on the outskirts of the city, where Sinopoli was taken into protective custody, he was held without bail. Separated from the general population due to the nature of his alleged crime and his age, his court-appointed attorney, a seasoned public defender named Marcus Halford, faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was ironclad, a direct match that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. Halford's method, such as it was, centered on negotiating a plea deal that might prevent Sinopoli from going to trial and spending the rest of his life in prison. But the Lancaster County District Attorney, a woman named Patricia Owens, who had built her career on prosecuting violent crimes, was resolute. She desired a conviction that was recorded, a formal acknowledgement of guilt that would give Lindy's family the closure they had been denied for nearly 5 decades. In a courtroom, the preliminary hearing took place in August 2022, packed with viewers, reporters, and Lindy's family members. Miriam Beckler, now using a walker, was helped to a seat in the front row by her son, David, Lindy's older brother, who had flown in from Virginia, where he had retired after a career in the military. Miriam's hands trembled as she clutched a photograph of Lindy, the same wedding photo that had appeared in newspapers in 1975. In a moment of joy that now seemed so far away, her daughter's face remained frozen. Kenneth Beckler, who is now 66, aged and residing in Delaware, she was unable to attend. He had told Detective Malloy in a brief phone conversation that he could not bring himself to face the man who had destroyed his life, that the memories were too raw, too visceral, even after all these years.
Detective Malloy took the stand and testified about the genetic genealogy process, explaining in careful, methodical detail how Parabon Nanolabs had used familial DNA matches to construct a family tree that led investigators to Sinopoly. He talked about the surveillance operation, the retrieval of the coffee cup, the lab analysis that confirmed the match. He was cross-examined by the defense attorney, who looked for flaws and said that genetic genealogy was still a new field and that mistakes could happen. But Malloy's testimony was solid, supported by documentation and expert analysis. And when he stepped down from the stand, the courtroom understood that the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Pennsylvania-based forensic scientist, testified next, demonstrating the DNA comparison to the court. On a projector screen, she showed charts and graphs highlighting the genetic markers that were consistent with the blood sample taken from Sinopoly's discarded coffee cup and the blood found on the knife in 1975. The probability of this being anyone other than the defendant is approximately 1 in 6.7 quadrillion, she stated, her voice calm and authoritative. The number hung in the air, incomprehensible in its magnitude, a statistical certainty that left no room for doubt. Halford, the defense attorney, did not challenge the science. He could not. He instead concentrated on his client's age, lack of criminal record, and decades of law-abiding citizenship. However, the judge, Thomas Brennan, who had been in charge of the Lancaster County Court of Common Plea for 20 years, was unmoved. "The passage of time does not diminish the severity of the crime," he said, his voice echoing by way of the courtroom. "A young woman was brutally murdered in her own home. That fact remains unchanged, regardless of how many years have passed." In November 2022, faced with the inevitability of conviction, David Sinopoly entered a guilty plea. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The words that confirmed what the DNA had found were said by Sinopoly as he stood before the judge, his face expressionless and his shoulders slightly hunched. Guilty. He didn't explain, he didn't apologize, and he didn't say why he went into Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment that December afternoon in 1975 and killed her with such brutality. His silence was maddening to those who had waited so long for answers, a final act of withholding that denied Lindy's family the understanding they desperately sought. The January 2023 sentencing hearing provided Lindy's family with an opportunity for victim impact statements, to speak directly with the individual who had robbed them of so much. Miriam Beckler, her voice shaking but determined, addressed the court from her wheelchair, her son standing beside her for support. "For 47 years, I have lived with a hole in my heart that can never be filled," she said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Every Christmas, every birthday, every moment of joy has been shadowed by the absence of my daughter. Mister, you took her from us, Sinopoly. You took her future, her children she would have had, the life she was deserving of. And for 47 years, you walked free while we suffered. I hope that you will spend every day of your remaining life reflecting on what you did, the suffering you caused, and the beautiful girl whose life you ended." Her words were met with silence, the courtroom gripped by the rawness of her grief. David Beckler,
Lindy's brother, spoke next, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. My sister was kind, gentle, trusting. She let people into her home because she believed generosity of others. And you exploited that trust. You destroyed our family. My parents have spent nearly 5 decades waiting for this day, and it brings them no peace, only the bitter knowledge that justice came too late. He turned to face Sinopoli, who was seated at the defense table with his back to the ground. David demanded, raising his voice, "Look at me. Take a look at your actions." David turned away with his hands in the air as Sinopoli did not raise his head or acknowledge the devastation he had caused, his body trembling with rage and sorrow as he clenched his fists. Sinopoli received the maximum possible sentence under Pennsylvania law, which was life in prison without the possibility of parole from Judge Brennan. This court recognizes that no sentence can restore what was taken from the Beckler family, he said, his tone grave. Lindy Sue Beckler and her family's suffering cannot be erased by serving time in prison.
But this sentence ensures that the defendant will spend the remainder of his life answering for his crime, that the community will be shielded from any further harm he may cause, and that he will never again walk free. As Sinopoli was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face still blank, several members of the gallery began to cry, their tears a mixture of relief, grief, and the profound sadness that accompanies justice delivered too late. In the weeks that followed, Manor Township grappled with the revelation that one of its own had harbored such a dark secret for so long. David Sinopoli's family, his wife and through their attorney, adult children, issued a brief statement expressing shock and offering sympathy to the Beckler family. They had known nothing, they insisted, had seen no signs of violence or guilt, had lived alongside a man who had hidden his crime so thoroughly that even those closest to him had remained oblivious. Some people were skeptical about the statement, wondering how anyone could live with such knowledge for 47 years without revealing any of it. However, other community members understood that monsters rarely look the part, that evil often wears the mask of normalcy, that the capacity for violence can coexist with the appearance of ordinariness in ways that defy comprehension. Lindy Sue Beckler's grave, located in a quiet corner of the Manor Township cemetery beneath a sprawling oak tree, became a site of pilgrimage in the months following Sinopoli's conviction. Strangers left flowers, handwritten notes, small tokens of remembrance. "You" was written in meticulous script on lined paper on one note. "Are not forgotten. Your tale has been listened to. Rest in peace." The Beckler family visited regularly, and on the first anniversary of Sinopoli's arrest, they held a small memorial service attended by Detective Malloy, members of the genealogy team from Parabon, and a handful of longtime residents who had never stopped thinking about the young woman who had died in 1975. Although her health was deteriorating, Miriam Beckler's spirit was unbroken. She laid a white rose bouquet on the grave and whispered words that only she and her daughter could understand. To hear. The case of Lindy Sue Beckler became a touchstone in the rapidly evolving field of genetic genealogy. Cited in academic papers, discussed at law enforcement conferences, and featured in true crime documentaries that examined how advances in DNA technology were bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Parabon Nanolabs used the case as an example of what was possible when evidence was carefully preserved and modern science was applied with precision and care. Detective Malloy, who had led the investigation in its final stages, received commendations from the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office and the Pennsylvania State Police, but he deflected praise, insisting that the credit belonged to the scientists and genealogists who had done the painstaking work of constructing the family tree that led to Sinopoli.
For Kenneth Beckler, the news of Sinopoli's conviction brought a complicated mixture of emotions. In a once-in-a-lifetime phone interview with a local newspaper in Delaware, he spoke haltingly about the impact of Lindy's murder on his life. "I've spent 47 years trying to outrun that day," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I tried to forget, moved away and started over, but you can't forget something like that. It's always there in the back of your mind and your dreams. Lindy cannot be brought back simply by knowing who did it. It does not alleviate the pain. But maybe it means she can rest now. Maybe we all can." He took a breath and paused, audible over the line. "I hope so." The dress Lindy wore to her wedding on July 19, 1975. The dress that Miriam Beckler had preserved in a garment bag for nearly 5 decades was donated to a small museum in Lancaster that focused on local history. It was displayed alongside Lindy's photograph in a placard that told her story, a reminder that behind every cold case was a person, a life cut short, a family forever changed. When they visited the museum, visitors frequently stood for long periods of time in front of the display to study the words, the picture of the young woman with her gentle smile, and I left knowing more about how fragile safety is and how long grief lasts. As communities always do, Manor Township carried Lindy Sue Beckler's memory into a future she would never see, forever marked by the events of December 5, 1975. Even though the unit on the second floor had been renovated multiple times, the apartment building on West Delp Road was still standing. The floors were replaced, the walls were painted over, and the physical evidence of eradication of violence by human effort and time. But the psychological imprint remained, woven into the fabric of the community's collective memory. A reminder that darkness can hide in plain sight, that justice, though delayed, can still arrive, and that the dead, though silent, are never truly forgotten. On a cold December morning in 2023, exactly 48 years after Lindy's murder, Miriam Dare passed away in her sleep at the age of 90. She was mentioned in the Lancaster newspaper's obituary as a beloved daughter, Lindy, and noted that Miriam had lived long enough to see justice served. She was buried beside her daughter in the Manor Township cemetery, the 2 graves side by side beneath the oak tree, their headstones bearing the same last name, their lives bound together by love and tragedy. At the funeral, attended by family and friends and Detective Malloy, who had come to pay his respects, a pastor spoke of Miriam's strength, her unwavering faith, and her refusal to let her daughter be forgotten. 47 years, he said, his voice echoing throughout the gathering, for answers. And when those answers finally came, she held them close, a gift delivered too late, but treasured nonetheless. A single white rose was laid on Lindy's grave at the end of the service, placed there by an unidentified person as a final tribute to a young woman whose name, once whispered in fear and sorrow, would now be remembered as a symbol of reclaimed justice. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories. Your support helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Comment down below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for the closure that finally came to the Martinez family after nearly half a century of searching.